Reflecting on your podcast's legal journey. Boxing Day is here, and while most people are packing up decorations or sorting out what to discard or donate or keep, today we're doing the same for your podcast legal setup. It's time to reflect on the past year, clear out the clutter, fix what's broken, and prepare for a fresh start in the coming year. So, are you ready to protect your podcast and set it up for long term success? Well, if so, let's dive in. Hi there, I'm Gordon Firemark, the podcast lawyer, and I hope you had a wonderful Christmas. Today is Boxing Day, the 26th of December, and welcome to this Legit Podcast Pro Boxing Day edition, where we are drawing inspiration from that tradition of sorting and organizing to reflect on your podcast's legal journey. Whether you are launching your first show or running a well-oiled podcasting machine, this episode is packed with actionable tips that will help you evaluate where you stand legally, address potential weak spots, and prepare to crush it in the new year. So let's just start right off with segment one, a year-end legal health check. Let's take that in stride. So think of it like a checkup for your podcast. The idea is to identify any gaps in your legal setup, update any outdated contracts, ensure everything is working as you intend. First, review any formal documents associated with your podcast. That's contracts with your co-hosts, producers, editors, or anyone else involved in your production. Also with the networks, with sponsors, those kinds of things. I look at, for example, have there been any changes in the responsibilities or what's going on in those relationships? For example, you say you added a new co-host mid-year, but you didn't formalize those terms in writing. Well, now is a good time to fix that. Next, take a look at your business structure. If you're treating your podcast as a hobby, but you've started earning revenue through sponsorships or ads or merchandise, well, it might be time to look at setting up an LLC or another kind of legal entity. This one simple step could protect your personal assets if anything goes wrong. It could open you up to be able to take certain tax deductions that wouldn't otherwise be available. And next up, you want to take an audit of your workflows. Look for areas where you could use more legal coverage. Like, do you need non-disclosure agreements? Do you have guest releases signed every time? Are you using agreements with the freelancers that you have on your team, your editor, your producers, researchers, those kind of folks? Taking these little kinds of steps can really save you from big headaches down the road. Next up, I want you to do an intellectual property audit. What did you create this year? When you think about it, your podcast is a treasure trove of intellectual property. Every episode, every logo, even the catchy taglines you've come up with could hold real value. But there's a catch. If you don't protect it, well, somebody else could potentially claim it. So start by taking an inventory of your intellectual property. List out all that stuff, episodes, logos, any sound effects you might have created, music you've created or commissioned. Do you have clear documentation showing that it's yours, that you own it? If you worked with designers, editors, and music producers, do you have contracts to assign the ownership to you? One often overlooked area is trademark protection. Is your podcast's name distinctive? If you are building a recognizable brand, registering your podcast name and maybe your artwork or logo as trademarks can prevent others from using similar names and causing confusion in the eyes and ears of the audience. This is especially important as you grow and expand into other things, as you add YouTube and video and courses or live events. So think of this as locking the doors of your podcasting house. It might seem like an unnecessary step, but it really is kind of crucial for long-term growth and protection. And if you ever do find yourself in a position to want to sell your podcast, having these assets lined up and properly registered and what we call perfecting title can really matter. Okay, next up, revisit all of your other contracts and relationships. Podcasting is, after all, a collaborative effort for many folks. So whether you're working with co-hosts, freelancers, sponsors, whatever, as those relationships evolve, so will the terms of those relationships, those deals, and the contracts should reflect it. So take a moment to revisit your contracts. If you are working with a co-host, do you have a written agreement outlining who owns what, who does what, and how revenue is going to be shared? Without this, disputes can arise when the podcast starts to generate significant income or if someone decides to leave. If you have sponsorships, ask yourself, are the terms still working for all the parties? Maybe you've grown significantly and you feel the need to renegotiate the advertising rates, or maybe you had a short-term sponsor agreement that hasn't been formally renewed, but continues on a handshake basis. Formalizing those relationships with new contracts, updated contracts, can prevent misunderstandings and keep things really professional. Okay, next up is licenses and permissions, cleaning that stuff up. Music, sound effects, and images can add life to your podcast, but they can also create important legal vulnerabilities if you're not careful about the permissions you've get and got. Permissions you've gotten. How confident are you that everything you've used in your podcast this year is properly licensed? So start by reviewing that asset library of yours. If you've downloaded music or effects, do you have the licenses to prove that you're authorized to use them? If not, go round them up now and put them in a file. And if you are using free to use content, make sure that those license terms haven't changed. That actually happens more often than you might think, and a change could mean that you're suddenly infringing on someone's rights. That's why I recommend not doing too much of that free stuff. And let's not forget about your guests. If a guest brought copyrighted material onto your show, like a song clip or a photo or read some poetry or something, and you used it in your podcast, you could be liable. Having that guest release form that covers this is a simple but powerful safeguard. Taking the time to organize and clean up your permissions now can help you avoid expensive legal disputes in the future. Next up, insurance coverage. Now, this is not a topic that podcasters think about very often, but I want you to start thinking about it because it's one of the smart ways to protect yourself. Because podcasting isn't as low risk as it might seem. So let's break down a few of the types of insurance to consider. We'll get into a deeper dive on this soon. But media liability insurance is what covers you if someone claims that your content is defaming them or infringes on a copyright or harms their reputation or something like that. And it's especially important if your podcast is into covering controversial topics or critiquing people and the things that they've done. General liability insurance is what you would need if you record in a studio and a guest or a team member has an accident, trips over equipment. You could be held liable. This kind of policy insures against physical damages or injuries. Now, if the team member is actually an employee, then you need workers' compensation insurance to cover that kind of injury. But if they're an independent contractor or a volunteer, it's the general liability. Your guests, it's always going to be the general liability. Next up is what we call errors and omissions insurance. If you have sponsors and they claim your podcast didn't meet the agreed on terms, well, this kind of insurance could help cover legal costs. So talk to an insurance agent familiar with the creative industries to make sure your coverage fits your needs. It's a safety net you hope you'll never need, but you'll be grateful for if the unexpected happens. So preparing for the next year, as we head into 2025, let's think about setting some legal goals for your podcast. Maybe this is the year that you formalize the podcast as a business, as an LLC or a corporation, file for the trademark, and finally get your contracts in order. Or maybe you want to improve your processes by implementing non-disclosure agreements or guest release forms or better monetization deals. Whatever your goals are, treat them as non-negotiable steps toward protecting your podcast and its future. Start by prioritizing the biggest gaps in your current setup and tackle them one at a time, because progress is key here. Perfection is impossible and it will just slow you down if you're always trying to get it perfect. So finally, let's lighten our load. What can you discard or donate or optimize in your podcasting workflow? Discard outdated practices. For instance, if you've been using vague handshake agreements, well, time to toss those and replace them with proper contracts. Did you learn something this year that could help others? Donate. Share it with the podcasting community, whether it's a resource, a legal tip, or lessons from a mistake that you've made. And optimize what's working. If you have systems that get the job done but could be more efficient, like upgrading to legal templates or automating your processes, well, make it a goal to improve them. What's important is do more of what works and less of the stuff that doesn't. That gives you the free bandwidth, essentially, to experiment with new things in hopes that they work. Just don't commit to things for too long without determining that there's some metric you can measure so you can decide what's working and what's not. So that's it for this episode. Thank you for joining me on this Boxing Day reflection on your podcast legal journey. Remember, the legal side of podcasting isn't glamorous, but it is what keeps your creativity safe and your business thriving. If you are ready to get your legal house in order, I hope you'll visit podcastlawforms.com. That's your one-stop shop for lawyer-created templates designed specifically for podcasters. And here is to a legally sound, successful 2025. Happy Boxing Day, and I'll see you next time on Legit Podcast Pro.